Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture from the workshop Political Economy Based on Marx. The workshop's title, I remind, is We Cannot Afford Their Peace, We Cannot Bear Their Wars, Value, Exploitation, Profitability, Crisis and Rectification. So in the last lecture we covered value quite extensively. We went through dialectical materialism, historical materialism, the critique of political economy, and we spent quite a lot of time talking about value because although there are a lot of people, a lot of economists saying that they are Marxists, they tend to be condescending when it comes to the law of value or even reject it as a concept or accuse it of a substantialist concept, not an actual one. So after we covered this one, today we move to a bit more juicy parts. We will go through exploitation, and in the third and final session we will cover profitability, crisis and rectification. So today's class is on Marx and surplus value, wages and the rate of profit. And the material we cover is quite a lot again and compact, so hopefully you can pause and reflect on the topic, then continue when you feel ready. So we talk how money transforms to capital in capitalism, the commodification of labor versus labor power. This is another contribution of Marx. What is capital? We hear a lot of things from mainstream economics. That's not the case always. The components of capital, how surplus value is produced, labor wage in capitalism, surplus value and unpaid labor. We define what unpaid labor is because there is a lot of literature not necessarily agreeing on definition or having a uniform definition. The allocation of surplus value, the profit of the industrialist capitalist, and some interesting concepts such as differentiating between intra-industrial competition and inter-industrial competition, something that mainstream economics and other schools of thought in economics do not necessarily do. And we will end up talking about the birth of the reserve army of labor and the immiseration of the proletariat, and at the end the basic contradiction of capitalism. So quite a lot of things. So this is the essential reading. All material, as I said, is provided. If it's not provided, it's quite easy to find online. Let's summarize from last session. We discussed value and the fundamental relationship in comparison to Adam Smith. So this is Marx's definition, as we said, the fundamental law of value. For first time in history of economic thought, price is brought together with the value of the commodity, discounted by the value of money. And we highlighted that Adam Smith had similar approaches on value, not 100% a theory of value, and had some theory and approach towards price, but never linked those two together in one single formula that economists love doing. And we also explained the law of value again as the formula, but also that money have value. And I asked you if you have time and accessibility to data sets, particularly from US and UK, that are quite easy to access. To replicate some results, take the CPI, the price index, take all the labor hours from all workers and divide that, so basically to find the value of money. And if this is less than 1, it means sellers have more in stock than the buyers. And if money doesn't have as much value as less than 1, means sellers have less in stock. And this might remind inflationary situations like the one that we experience right now, 2022. So this is what we said last time. And we also introduced slightly this lecture by saying, okay, that's the law of value, probably existed in other social formations, in other modes of production like feudalism, and it did exist. And it might exist in socialism, maybe for a few years as a form of exchange, as a method of exchange. There might be planning, different economic calculation problem. But what is the specificity? What is the difference of law of value in the other modes of production in comparison to capitalism? And Marx said the difference is that the law of value is applied now to labor. So labor is transformed into a commodity. it has use value and value, so it is exchanged for things. And this gives birth to the law of surplus value, what we're going to discuss today. Surplus value or exploitation. Exploitation is not just a moral concept, it is an economic concept, and we will go through that very soon. So the simple versus the capitalist commodities production. So what is the difference? Okay, here you have two contradicting pictures. One is the producer itself of these rugs or fabric, probably trades in an open market, and whatever money she makes, it's all hers, I mean, after she paid it for the suppliers. But what happens here, of course, a picture shows a picture of the stock market to represent today's capitalism, that these people have not produced any of the things they're exchanging. And so what is the difference then? The difference can be found, can be highlighted in this little table. On the first column you have the simple commodities production, and the other we have the capitalist commodities production. And I briefly introduced you in the last lecture that in the simple commodities production we have producers producing a commodity C, using money to exchange it to buy a different commodity. So if they have produced too many rugs or too much fabric, they will use this money to buy fruits and vegetables. But in capitalism it's not the same. In capitalism we have the reverse process. People entering the people, capitalists, those who have money, enter the production having money, an original amount of money, invested in whatever commodity, doesn't matter, as long as it gives more money. So that's the difference between these two processes. And MCM was not always the case. It's a particular phenomenon of capitalism, and this is how it should be analyzed. But these processes, the simple commodities production and the capitalist commodity production, have similarities. Similarity is specialization in production of specific products. Of course, there has to be specialization, a division of labor, a person that is specialized in creating fabric, others in cultivating fruits and vegetables, and then exchange. The production of commodities for selling them, so everyone is producing commodities to sell them. None of them produces commodities just for themselves. And there is private ownership in the means of production. Probably the lady we saw earlier owns some kind of workshop, and that's why she manages to have ownership of the rugs or whatever these things are to sell them. The same, of course, for capitalist production. But there are some differences, and the differences are in the kind of labor they use. In the simple commodity production, it's me, the freelancer. I'm on my own. I use personal labor to pay the rent, to buy the raw material, personal labor to sew the rugs, etc., etc. But in the capitalist production, that's not the same. You use wage labor. Basically, I'm the capitalist, I own the factory, I own the raw material, and I use other workers, foreign labor, not as migrants, labor that is not personal, to have these things made. The other distinction is that the product belongs to the employee in the first case. The first case, the lady that sells the rugs probably, from the picture you can see, the rugs and the product belongs to her, and there's nothing you can do about that. But in the capitalist production, whatever you produce belongs to the capitalist. So I'm a teacher, I'm a lecturer in a university, so the university slides I produce, they need to have, let's say, the university, and so they're not 100% mine. Or easier example, if you're a worker producing shoes, the shoes you produced for the day do not definitely belong to you. And in the first case, there is no exploitation of human by human. It's just the person that, with their toil and efforts, trying to make some money. Or in the second case, the capitalist exploits wage labor. Why do we say exploits wage labor? Why do we use this harsh word? Why don't we just say they offer their factory to workers to make a living for themselves, and also the capitalists to make a profit? Well, the reason is, think for yourselves, if you are a capitalist and you want to hire employees, The only way you will hire these employees is if they produce more than they cost. Otherwise, you don't hire them. If you're to give them exactly what they produce, then you're not a capitalist. You're probably a charity offering some space in your, in your workplace or something, in your buildings. So, but of course, we will justify the concept of exploitation very, very soon. So these are the differences. So a lot of times you see neoclassical economics saying, assuming actually that capitalism works like that. We have a good money exchange for other good, and they do not acknowledge this fact, the fact that it doesn't work like that. Production starts in capitalism for the capitalist to make more profit. That's the incentive. But they know that that's the incentive, but they do not start with that. They start like with this concept. So transforming money to capital, as we said in the simple commodities production, is CMC accent, but in the capitalist is MCM accent. Capitalists, in order to occupy labor, they need means of production, so they need to, with this money, to buy means of production, produce a certain product, and then make more money. And the difference between M accent, the new money, we assume it's more, the new money, we assume it's a successful business, basically, and the new money minus the original money invested, Marx calls it surplus value. This is the surplus value. If at the end of the process, if I invested 100 and at the end of the process have 120, this 20 is the surplus value. And is capital. This is capital. This is how we define as capital, which is basically value. In this case, it has a form of money. It might just have the form of a machinery. So it is a value that provides more surplus value through labor exploitation. So if neoclassical economists come and tell you, okay, if they come and they actually tell you that even the caveman's butt is capital for him, it's usually him back then, to get more fruits or to kill more animals, then they project it as a correct methodology. But that's not capital, though, because it is not a value that gives surplus value through labor exploitation. Basically, they do not hire someone else to hold the bat and beat the animal and then get the animal themselves. So in that case, yes, they would probably discuss a bit differently, but primitive people did not own capital. So capital is a very specific historical form. It appears only in capitalism. Does this mean that other modes of production didn't have means of production? Of course they had means of production, but the specific form that means of production take in capitalism, this is what we call capital. We don't capital every means of production throughout history. We call capital some specific means of production that help you produce surplus value in capitalism. So it's a very specific historical form. And this brings us to the other concept that Marx helped us understand capital better, which is the distinction between labor and labor power. All economists, including mainstream economics and classical economists, they thought it's that although labor produces everything, true, they thought that workers are rewarded, the salary is a reward, they're rewarded for the labor. And Marx make this distinction. No, they perform labor, but they're paid for their labor power. So labor is the work actually performed. So abstract labor, as we discussed in the previous lecture. Work actually performed. Labor is expended through the process of production, and this is what produces value. So the abstract labor, the average effort of humans, is what gives value to products. So labor is the force that gives value to commodities, and labor does not have value. Labor is value. So we cannot say what is the value of labor. It's like saying what is the value of value. So labor gives value, and it's not what salary is paying for. Salary, wages is not paying for labor. Salary is paying for labor power. We will explain further. Labor power is the ability to work, all the physical and mental abilities of humans that are expended in the production process. So in capitalism, we have commodification of labor power. Basically, if you need a sandwich to survive the day, this is what you get. You get a sandwich to survive the day. You might have produced, as a worker, probably thousands of worth of value, but at the end of the day, you'll get a sandwich. And this is, unfortunately, the fate for some billions of people on Earth, that they get a sandwich, or people saying living with $1 or $2 per day. That represents a sandwich in the developed world, brackets developed. So, and that doesn't represent the work they have actually performed for that specific product. So in capitalism then, Marx says, we don't have commodification of labor, meaning labor is not paid a wage, it's labor power, what the worker needs to survive in order for them to be able to come next day and also be equally productive. So just the minimum things. And this is what becomes a commodity in capitalism. Labor power is the commodity. And labor power, since is a commodity, it has a value and a use value. The use value, the usefulness, what is useful for is that this worker provides more than it needs in terms of salary. Or as we said earlier, the only way someone will hire you in their business as a worker, as an employee, is if you produce more than you cost. That's the usefulness of having a worker. They produce more compared to what they cost. And what is the value of the labor power is the value of means of existence. So all these small and bigger things that someone needs to survive. Let's say a salary to pay for the rent, to pay for the groceries, to pay for transportation, etc., etc. This is the value of labor power, and basically the wage you get eventually. But we will see that this also depends on other reasons. So labor power is the commodity, and labor power, because it's a commodity, as we analyzed in the previous lecture, has both use value, usefulness, making profit, and value. The usefulness is that it provides more than it costs. So yes, that's that's the concept here. So what is capital then? We discussed what is commodified in capitalism, which is labor power and not labor. So what is capital? Mainstream economics, we said capital is an object with which you can acquire another object. And I brought the bat at the caveman's hands is a capital. But for Marx, capital is neither an object nor money. Capital is a specific relationship of production between people. Did not ever existed. Capital is a value, abstract labor. Basically, a machinery I might have as a capitalist is abstract labor, workers' labor embodied, represented by this machinery that brings surplus value to its owner through labor exploitation. With this machinery, I can hire a worker, they can operate this machine, they can bring me more product and higher profits. So machines, raw material are not capital, means of exploitation on their own. Machines, raw material, etc. become capital if and only if they are owned by the capitalist. So if private capitalist ownership is abolished, the machines, raw material are just means of production, as we said earlier. And what are the components of capital? We have the constant part of capital, which is part of capital that is spent on the means of production. So what capitalists buy to start the investment, maybe rent a building, buy or rent machinery. And we have the variable capital that is spent for buying labor power. This is for workers. And the constant capital is divided between fixed, which is something you cannot easily move or change, factories, buildings, machinery, but also circulating capital, capital, which is value of raw materials. If you own, let's say, a big coffee shop, capital would be, so fixed capital would be the espresso machine, the big espresso machine, and raw material would be the coffee beans, the sugar, milk, and of course labor power would be the workers you hire for them to do your job. So why are we interested in that? Because the proportion of machinery over workers or constant capital over variable capital is representing the organic composition of capital. It tells how labor or capital intensive basically an industry is. And this is important because we will discuss soon the the competition between capitalists and why this is important. So how is surplus value produced? Surplus value is produced if we have a firm here, constant capital. Basically, I'm not going to spend here much time on the example. We can do it live, but you can pause the video and take as given only the things are only the values that are in black, and then you can derive the rest based on the formulas. Sorry, this should be lambda, not W. Sorry. Yes, and this should be lambda, not W. Yes. So yes, this is the problem. You can train on your own and find out how practically, with a very simple example, surplus value is produced. And here we go with the decomposition of surplus value. So labor expended is the whole, let's say, 8 hours you have worked, right? Part of this day goes to you. So part of this day you work for yourself as a worker to pay for your to cover your wages basically, and another part is the surplus value extracted, so what goes to the capitalist. So if within a day you have produced product of £320, let's say, and £80 per day is your wage, your daily wage, it means that the rest of the money have gone to the capitalist directly. Of course, we can do that. We can express that in hours as well, or if you work 8 hours, 2 hours are for yourself, 6 are for the capitalist. So in other words, the necessary working time the worker works for his salary, their salary, while in the surplus working time is the time that the worker has worked for the capitalist. And we have necessary working time and surplus working time that comprise your whole working day. So necessary is for you, surplus is for the capitalist that you work in their businesses. So this is the concept that Marx launched, but he didn't take it from his stomach. Basically, he was based on what happened in the previous modes of production. That's why we started our lectures in the previous lecture by describing historical materialism, the different modes of production, slavery-based society, feudalism, capitalism, because I didn't want to start with capitalism like there was nothing else before, like there is no continuation of concepts and exploitation and class, etc., etc. So where does Marx then take his ideas from? It takes it from the previous modes of production. In the previous modes of production, it was crystal clear that from the 7 days of the week, 6 days is for the master during the slavery mode of production or the antique mode of production, and 1 day you had for yourself to, in the best case scenario, to recover. In feudalism, it was a bit better. You had to work. The arrangement between the serf and the feudal lord was that you will work 3 days for the master and the other 3 days for yourself, and 1 day for you to practice religion, etc., etc. In capitalism, it's not as clear. We work, let's say, 8 hours, and 4 of them goes to the master, okay, the employer. I should say master, here I should say lord, oops, not Greek, have Greek. Here I should say, lord, and this is say capitalist. And the other 4 hours go for yourself as an employee, as a worker. So, but because you're paid in wage form, this obscures the exploitation. It appears like your salary, these £8 we saw earlier, represent the whole day. But in fact, they don't represent the whole day. We saw only part represents the whole day. Where are we here? Yeah. The rest is surplus produced. So surplus led humanity to move from privy to communism to the first class-based modes of production. And surplus is, for Marx, what will help humanity exit for class exploitation, and we move to socialism, communism, etc., etc., because we will have achieved so much surplus. And in the meantime, workers will have revolted that this will be distributed eventually equal among the members of society. So yeah, Marx is learned some lessons from history and says it's not that capitalism suddenly becomes not exploitative, it just alters the form of exploitation. We cannot see it, the wage obscures this. But if you work a lot of hours and you see your employer having a lot of profit and you get pennies and you feel exploited, then you correctly feel exploited. So probably you don't need political economy to tell you that, but yeah, here we are to provide also some empirical and theoretical justification why you feel that at the end of the day. And of course, with the division of labor and the fact that every worker is specializing on different things, the production is like the Adam Smith's pin factory example, that one worker can make only 1 pin per day individually as an individual, but if 40 workers come together, they will not create 40 pins per day, but they will create 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 pins per day. So basically, by having division of labor, you manage to achieve dimensions of product not recorded ever before. And these dimensions, of course, are not equally, these dimensions of product are not equally distributed to people, to the workers, but instead they're adopted, they're appropriated by the capitalist. And Marx has created a ratio to describe that. The ratio is this, surplus value ratio. So we used S, where is it? S, capital, to describe surplus value, and now S lowercase accent to describe the rate of surplus value, which is total surplus value produced by the individual worker, let's say, over the variable of the individual worker, or the surplus working time from the individual worker divided by the necessary working time of the individual worker. And this, alternatively, we call it rate of exploitation, so surplus value by the capitalist over employees' wages, or additional working time, necessary working time. Oops, let's be consistent, not additional, let's be surplus. It's also called additional. So what is the rate of surplus value in our previous example? That we produced 320 pounds of product, but only 80 went to the worker and the other 240 to the capitalist. This is the ratio, or in terms of hours, 6 hours to the capitalist, 2 hours to the worker is 3, or 300% is the rate of surplus value. You are exploited 3 times, basically, more than you're paid. And if we are to accumulate, if we are to add all the individual rates of exploitation to a total and aggregate rate of exploitation, we have to add all individual workers' surplus time divided by all individual workers' salary, and then we have the general rate of exploitation that describes the whole business or the whole economy. And here the notation is explained. You can pause, you can reflect, and keep notes and ask questions later when we have face-to-face, or email me. So this is the rate of surplus value, or exploitation. They are not exactly the same. Marx says way more things why exploitation and surplus value are not the same concept, and this has to do with distinguishing labor into productive and unproductive. But this takes place in volume 2, 3, and the 3 volumes of the theories of surplus value. So we don't have time to do that in 3 lectures of this workshop. But feel free to go into these deep waters if you want to learn more, or just contact me for more material, if you want advice for more material. But yeah, exploitation, at least for volume 1, capital and surplus value, we will treat it as the same concept. And these are some empirical facts from the UK, the United Kingdom. What is the surplus value or the rate of exploitation from 1955 to 2009? We can see it was pretty stable in the 50s, 60s, 70s and slightly dropping. And then question, what happens mid-70s and then the rate of exploitation went up until early 90s? Yes, if you said Thatcher, probably you are correct. Thatcher, with all the anti-union laws, all the laws against the workers, eventually released powers of capitalists to exploit workers even more, and at some point starts falling, early 90s, then starts going up again, with slightly before Tony Blair, but takes the first years of Tony Blair, then drops again. Here they say, a lot of people say it's due to the Working Time Directive. It reduced the working hours, and therefore the rate of exploitation. Will go into that through details. So basically, why does the rate of exploitation behave like that? For Britain, of course, there are so many political and economic reasons that explain that. But let's move back to theory. So the labor wage in capitalism. So what is the value then of labor power? The value, we said, of labor power is represented by the means of subsistence that the worker needs in order to survive. And these are not universal for everyone. They depend on some factors. They depend on natural needs: food, clothing, fuel, housing. For instance, countries in the northern hemisphere with cooler weather will need more fuel. Therefore, salaries in these countries might be higher than salaries in the southern countries. Of course, that's not the only reason. So there is the physical component, the natural needs. What do we need to protect ourselves from the environment, and being able, equally healthy to yesterday, to offer our labor again to the capitalist production. But there is also another component. So apart from the natural needs, there is a component of achievements of the working class. Political, economic struggles, such as a successful strike. We're quite rich of these examples. The 19th, 20th, and even now 21st century, particularly after the pandemic, we have we have more achievements than before, which is quite good, quite encouraging. So yeah, wage struggles through strikes, industrial action, trade union participation, etc., etc. So 2 components, one physical component, and the other we call it historical and social component. What has historically the working class of England achieved compared to the working class of Greece, where I'm from? So historically, the working class of England, they had many more years capital, and probably they have achieved a little more things than what we did in our country. But for neoclassical economics, it's not like that. For neoclassical economics, for those that have done some labor economics, wage represents MPL, the marginal product of labor, and R, profits or rate of profit, the marginal product of capital. Basically, they justify that that this system is just. Everyone takes what they have produced, and there is no exploitation, and definitely not much space for historical and social component. Of course, in labor economics there are unions and there is analysis of institutions and how they impact on wage, but it's not exactly the same approach. There is an inherent justification of this system in neoclassical labor economics. So what is the price of labor power? The price of labor power is the value of labor power expressed in money. And wage is what that workers received, which is not the price of labor, but the price of labor power. So wage is not the marginal product of labor, nothing to do with labor, but a lot to do with labor power, plus the class struggle and how successful their strikes and unions have been. This is what wage represents in capitalism. And this is very relevant analysis today, because there is a strike wave around the world. People, and especially in the United States, that we hadn't seen that for 60, 70 years, and it's quite interesting to see, especially after the pandemic. So in terms of maths, value of labor power then is wages, W, multiplied by the value of money. So here we have, as we saw earlier, where are we? Oops, sorry. As we saw earlier, price equal to value divided by the value of money. Something similar, that the wage, which is the price of labor power, equal to the value divided by the value of money. So the value of labor power divided the value of money. So this is the law of value, as we saw, applied on labor, which is the peculiarity of capitalism. The peculiarity of capitalism is to transform labor power into commodity. And the law value in mathematical terms, in formula, it is expressed like that. So if you know the salary, this is what we know usually from statistics, and you know the value of the means of subsistence, how much workers need to survive in a specific country, in specific historical conditions, you can find the value of money. Or you can derive the value of money by knowing the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the total working hours of a specific country in a specific year from all workers. You derive LM, the value of money. And if you know LM and the wage per hour, you can find the value of labor power per hour. So it's a very easy calculation you can do if you access data usually from developed countries. They have very detailed data, like the US has very good data set to do this exercise. So based on US data in 2010, the wage was $25.6 per hour. The value of labor power, therefore, was wages times the value of money. How do we know the value of money? From the previous calculation that we did. So what is the value of labor power in the US in 2010? 0.25 per hour. This is how much you're worth for the capitalist. If this was confusing or too much information, pause, go back, try to reflect and ask questions. And here we continue with the surplus value and unpaid labor. If this is the working day in capitalism, part of your working day we say is paid, represents your wages or your necessary labor time, and part represents unpaid labor, the profits or the surplus labor time. And this is what we define as unpaid labor, how Marx defines unpaid labor. Unpaid labor is not only some overtime that you worked and you were never paid. Labor time is not only, it is of course, but it's not only that. Unpaid labor time is the default situation for the overwhelming majority of workers on earth, according to Marx, right? And how can capitalists extract more surplus value based on that information, based on that schema? Marx says, one, easy, not always easy, is to extend the working day. Let's say we extend the working day by 2 hours. So if you were working 8 hours per day, you are forced through unpaid overtime, for instance, to work 2 extra hours. So the unpaid part is way bigger than the paid part of the day. So this is one way to extract more surplus value, and this is called absolute surplus value, because you extend the working day. The other part is the relative surplus value. That can happen through either dropping wages, just because it can be a directive, the government drops the minimum wage for instance, through a directive, and then capitalists follow and implement this. It can be through increased productivity. If capitalist brings new machinery that makes workers, instead of producing 5 items per hour, now they produce 25 items per hour. Or through increased intensification. So if I take less breaks, if I do quicker moves, etc., etc., so at the end of the day, at the end of the same working day, the 8-hour day, I have produced more. So these are the 3 ways that you can have the production of relative surplus value. Relative surplus value means the day is not extended, so you cannot see that you're exploited, but because all the other things have happened, you are in fact more exploited, because the unpaid labor time is way more than your paid time now. So this is the relative surplus value production, and capitalists play with that. They urge for laws that deregulate working day, or they favor laws that allow for a drop in real wages. Like now we have inflation, but in Britain, and for 12 years the real wages have not gone up. So what drives inflation? Profits, easy, okay. But in fact this is a policy that has squeezed wages. It's a wage reduction, basically, through a drop in real wages, through inflation. So there are so many mechanisms you can do that, and capitalists know it quite well from experience all these years. These are the cells of our analysis. If in the previous lecture we covered what is value, and now what is surplus value. So we had the cells, now had a bigger organism. Let's go to, so we had the cells, we had a bigger organism. Now we go to a much bigger, a much bigger part, which is the whole economy. So for Marx, the whole economy looks like this. So what is this? This is the composition of aggregate social product, or as we'd say, the GDP of the country, and how it is decomposed. In macroeconomics of year 1 undergraduate course, you will learn 3 approaches for measuring the GDP. The usual is you add the prices of all final goods and services. That's one. The second is the expenditure approach, that you say what part goes to consumption, what part goes to investment, what part is government spending, and exports minus imports. And you have the income part. This resembles more the income approach of GDP, which is what part goes to for capital and what part goes for labor. So the labor capital share of GDP, after you have of course subtracted the replacement of constant capital for machinery and stuff that still stay there for another year. So the aggregate social product, he doesn't call it GDP. The aggregate social product for Marx is divided into the replacement of constant capital and national income, as the income approach in mainstream accounts. And this national income is divided in 2 parts. It's not labor capital. It resembles it, but it's not. It's variable capital and surplus value. What is the difference? Variable capital goes for the wages of industrial workers, the productive workers, as Marx says later in other volumes. And part of the surplus value, of course, goes to capitalists, either the industrial capitalist or the merchant or the banker with interest rate or the ground rent, but also goes for wages for the non-productive workers or the unproductive workers. That's a big discussion. We're not going to examine this here so much in depth. But for Marx, not all workers produce surplus value. It doesn't say they're useless. They just don't produce surplus value. For instance, a builder is easy to understand. They take bricks, cement, and they create a house. So they produce a new value, a house. But a person working in retail trade, a worker in a retail trade that just exists, that has not transformed, hasn't taken the cotton, sew and create a new t-shirt, for instance. It's just therefore it's still useful, right? For the circulation, but it's not production. So that's the whole economy basically. These guys here produce everything, but they get only one fraction. Now, what does Marx mean? Shouldn't the rest of workers be paid? Of course not. They should be paid, but it's a different. It's a different. He doesn't say who should be paid. He doesn't use the schema to say who should be paid, but to explain how much work is involved with actual production, and how much work is involved in distribution or exchange of values. So, yeah, for Marx, this is how the economy looks like, and yeah, the paper I'm currently working on is basically this, implemented in the UK, but with some different contributions. Have a pause, reflect on that, ask questions about who's productive, who's unproductive. It doesn't have to do with usefulness, as I said, it has to do with the creation of values, because mainstream economics think that anything marketable is productive. So try to contrast these two concepts in your mind, and we can discuss questions and provide answers. And this is the notation. Sorry, it should be lambda in Greek, not W. Sorry, lambda. And this be lambda, the aggregate of all values, all values in total produced in the economy. And how can we measure then the profit of industrial capitalists? Back to the previous example, you do the maths, the profit, as we said, is 240, the surplus value, but some of these will go to the merchant worker as well, and to the banker, and to the unproductive workers. But overall, if you want to calculate the rate of profit, is the surplus value produced, the surplus value appropriated by the individual capitalist over the constant capital, the machinery and raw material they have paid for, plus the variable capital, the amount of workers they have hired in order to do this job. And in this example, the rate of profit is 11.5 or 11.54%. In other words, the rate of profit will always be different. The same example, I repeat, I haven't changed, it will be different from the rate of exploitation or the rate of surplus value. So rate of profit, different, smaller than the rate of surplus value. Example, the Amazon, right, the company. Of course, we're talking about billions of profits. I think during the first month of the pandemic in the news, they were saying that Jeff Bezos increased the profits of Amazon by $24 billion, which was huge. And then when you go to discuss in terms of rate of profit, I think Amazon's rate of profit is only 4%, so it sounds very small, but we're talking about billions here. While corporations like publishing corporations, the ones that we academics publish our articles, our books, etc., we're talking about a 40% rate of profit in this case. So they are more profitable, of course, not the same dimensions in making money as in the Amazon. In company, the Amazon. So, yeah, that's an example of that. And this will bring us, why we discuss all these concepts, why we discuss value, organic composition, a rate of exploitation, a rate of profit. Why do we need these concepts? First of all, because we are economists and we like inventing concepts that with one or two words, we can describe a whole phenomenon. And second, this will bring us to the next example, to the next level of analysis, the level of analysis of intra- and inter-industrial competition. How are these related, you will see very soon. So here we are. The role of competition. We have two kinds of competition in Marxian economics. Neoclassical economists do not, Neoclassical economics do not distinguish between these two. Neoclassical economics did not distinguish between intra-industrial competition, so competition within a branch, so basically these coffee brands here, Costa Cafe with Nero Cafe and Starbucks Cafe and Pret a Manger Cafe. So this is intra-industrial competition, how each one of these individual capitalists compete with each other. But we also have the concept of inter-industrial competition, how Google competes with Amazon and Amazon with Audi and with Domino's Pizza, etc., etc. Because there is competition among those as well. But we usually, in mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, tend to focus only on that. And we say, maybe if we differentiate our product slightly, so instead of chocolate with colorful sprinkles on our coffee, then we might get more clientele, etc., etc. So we know more about intra-industrial competition in mainstream economics than the inter-industrial competition from than inter-industrial competition that Marx also analyzes and explains why this is also important. So focusing on the intra-industrial competition, so competition within a branch, basically. Let's put that here. Yeah. And this should be lambda values. You have the rate of profit of a capitalist. So how can capitalists get higher rate of profit? This is what they're concerned with. They do not for Marx, they do not maximize their profits. They don't do MR equals MC, so marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Maybe they do it, but the majority of capitalists do not work on that. In fact, some research from 20 years ago, they found that only 15% of capitalists follow MR equals MC, what you learn in your first year, economics, to maximize profits. The majority of capitalists, follow different models. Some say satisficing, some say there are a lot of contributions in the recent years. For Marx, the essence, though, is they focus on average profits, so surplus value over capital, constant plus variable, how much they have invested, so how much money I get compared to how much I have invested. As we said earlier, Amazon is 4%, so for Amazon they try to make it 5%, they try to make it 10%, but they don't necessarily do MR equals MC. So what are the possible ways that you can make a rate of profit higher if you're a capitalist? One is through technical and technological improvements. Instead of espresso machine, the traditional espresso machine, I bought this fancy espresso machine that produces 10 coffees per minute instead of 1 coffee per minute. So that's an improvement. Basically, you end up investing more on that, on constant capital, and less on variable capital, less on workers. This should be the case. Increasing workers' exploitation, so making Starbucks worker not taking breaks, or work an extra hour, or dropping the real wage. Penalize them. If they make a coffee wrong, 50p will be subtracted by their hourly wage, for instance. And constant capital saving, so you can hire more workers in this case and not invest too much on equipment, but this is not always very popular. Usually most capitalists go for the first two. So the separate enterprises then, Costa versus Starbucks, the separate enterprises eventually have different conditions of producing their products, different organization, etc., etc. They have different mix of machinery, so slightly different constant capital and different workers, different mix of variable capital. And they end up producing different values. The value of industry I, let's say Starbucks, occupies this amount of constant capital, they pay this amount to their workers, and they manage to extract this amount of surplus values, no profits yet. While Costa, J, so L, lambda J, CJ, so they have a slightly different composition of constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, and they end up having slightly different value. The value of Starbucks might be £1 and the value of Costa might be 1.5, let's say. But what Marx informs us that happens with the intra-industrial competition is that after the markets of the forces of the market let free to interact, supply, demand. Okay, it doesn't explain that with supply and demand. Say firms manage to innovate, can undercut their selling price and then increase market share. Imitations cannot follow immediately. It will take some time. The innovators might get some part of the market, and they will temporarily decrease their profit rates because they have invested in C, which is at the denominator, constant capital. However, by decreasing selling price of the commodity, expanding their market share, they raise their profit margin on sales, and gradually the rate of profit becomes the top in the industry. Eventually, all producers sell the same commodity for approximately the same price, and then the leader of the industry prevails. So for Marx, the intra-industrial competition progressively, eventually, is characterized by equalization of price within branch. And this is what we see in the coffees that we buy. Wherever we buy from, it's pretty much the same price. It might be £2, £2.50, £3. It's not £1 and £20, the difference. Unless you go to an extremely fancy place and the coffee beans they use is from, I don't know, the moon or something, that requires a bit more investment. But overall, most homogeneous products have the same or pretty much the same price. So this is the process I described that happens when we have intra-industrial competition. The structure of the market, big oligopolies and smaller independent firms. The organic composition is, whether it's more capital and labor intensive, it's usually high with the big corporations and low with small and medium enterprises. The individual value of commodities should be lambda here. Is small because of the division of labor scales, production scales, and quite higher for small and medium enterprises. That's why you might pay the coffee a bit more in a small and medium enterprise, but not significantly more. The social value of commodities, the same for every enterprise. The rate of profit, it's higher in bigger corporations. Sorry, this should be lambda. And smaller in small and medium enterprises. The outcome is dominance in the market for the first and squeezed out by the large for the second. That's why we see not many small and medium enterprises survive in this process. And the organic composition of capital eventually for the whole industry becomes higher. So basically, if you want to enter the industry and you open a coffee shop, you need to have a very similar organic composition of capital. So capital over constant capital over variable capital. If you want to enter, that's why it becomes more and more competitive being a freelancer, a self-employed, than being a worker. It's better being a worker at some point to these big corporations than opening your own business, because the chances of surviving are very small. So yes, if you have any questions, write down your questions and we can discuss them in the seminars as well, or you can email me before or after. Moving on to the second kind of competition, the inter-industrial competition, is when some different industries compete with each other. And these different industries are they're so significantly different from each other that they have more differences than similarities. Let's say the organic composition is capital over variable, constant capital over variable is so different from the other. Let's say the organic composition of Amazon, I suspect, is probably higher than of Pizza Domino's. Pizza Domino's might need humans to make the pizzas. I don't know, I'm just speculating here. So yeah, so they start with different compositions of capital. And this is, give me a second. Yes, and this is, if you want to analyze the rate of profit a bit more, this is the rate of profit of individual capitalists, as we said, surplus value over constant plus variable capital. If you divide both the numerator and the denominator with V, the variable capital, you end up getting here the different ratios. and on the top you have the rate of exploitation, and at the bottom have the rate of organic composition of capital. Therefore, the same formula can be represented slightly differently. That gives us more meaning in economics to extract economic conclusions. So what does this mean? Your rate of profit will be small or smaller if your organic composition is higher. And here we go back to the example of Amazon contra versus the publishing companies. The Amazon, the company, has way high organic composition of capital because of the logistics and the big warehouses and all this fixed capital that is invested. So way higher composition of capital compared to publishing companies that it's labor intensive. It's all the scholars that write research and they publish, etc., etc. They maybe own a computer, maybe 2 computers, maybe 1, 2, 3 admin staff. But yeah, the investment on fixed capital in big corporations, okay, they have the printing as well, which is it doesn't take as much space or so much money as Amazon logistics cost, for instance. That's why Amazon has only 4% profit rate last time I checked, and publishing companies 40% last time I checked. So this is how it looks like. This is how Amazon competes with traditional publishing corporations. For instance, that's why Amazon now offers its own publishing. For instance, I can send whatever book I have or article and being published and being sold by the platform as well. So without the reviewer, the peer reviewer process, and all the traditional steps that a traditional publishing company can offer. That's why Amazon is craving probably the rates of profits of a publishing company. But of course, we're talking about different profits. There is no comparison in terms of the absolute profits there. So yes, and surplus value is created only by labor wage workers in enterprises in those branches of production where low organic composition of capital prevails. So yes, if your organic composition of capital is lower than the other industry, so if the publishing corporation has lower organic composition of capital than Amazon, then the rate of profit of publishing will be higher than the profit rate of Amazon. That's why eventually you see capitals from Amazon being moved, either trying to buy off traditional corporations, publishing corporations, or try to invest in more labor-intensive, less capital-investing corporations, because they have higher rates of profit, not absolute profit, but higher rates of profit. Sometimes it's not always the case. But for Marx, eventually, these movements of capital from one industry to the other, from the Amazon, Facebook, Google, to other, like publishing, like healthcare, like so many other industries, like food industry, etc., etc. This movement of capitals eventually for Marx, and not only for Marx, I think Adam Smith and Ricardo also said, will lead to an equalized rate of profit, a uniform rate of profit. That is the summary of all surplus values is extracted from every industry, divided by all constant plus all variable capitals of these industries. Therefore, the individual capitalist originator faces a separate rate of profit, Ri, but eventually these Ri or J or K, whatever, become a uniform rate of profit. So the inter-industrial competition leads not to the same price for the products, because they still have different composition of capital, different number of employees, etc., etc., but they will eventually lead to a uniform rate of profit. And that's very important for us to understand how capitalism works with a competition, why capitals move from one industry to the other, although it seems not as profitable in absolute terms. So this analysis of Marx of distinguishing inter-industrial competition from intra-industrial competition helps us understand a lot of things, why capitals move from one to the other and why we have seemingly unexpected investments. So yeah, what's that? Yeah, we did that as well. So yeah, if the organic composition is, it's the same applies to inter-industrial competition. Yes, rates of profit, sorry. Yes, and the price is going, and the price of the different products is going to be defined by the constant capital used plus the variable capital used, not plus the surplus value, that's price, but times 1 plus the rate of profit. And this is also the contribution of Marx compared, let's say, to Adam Smith. I'm going back to Adam Smith. For Smith, price is this: what the worker takes, what the capitalist takes, and what the landlord takes. And this is not related to the value produced. So back to our example. For Marx, the price is, the constant capital. Basically, how much capitalist has invented. Yes, fair enough. The variable capital, what the worker needs and what the worker gets, times something that is incorporating this, which is after the forces of a market have interacted with each other. And Marx tells us if the price is bigger than the value of the product, it tells the price is bigger of the value of the product if and only if the organic composition of that particular industry is higher than the organic composition of the whole economy, and conversely. It's all too much information and too much theory, but if you go to practice on this table, you will understand what I'm saying and what Marx basically said. So starting only with these, with these three columns, the columns with information that we know, and try to derive the rest based on the formulas that you learned. So give me a second. This is lambda. This is lambda. No have value. So basically, Marx says if you know this information, how much constant capital each industry uses, the leather industry or the textile industry or the robotics industry, it's something, let's say, you can find in public accounts. If you know how much constant capital the leather industry, the textile and the robotics industry uses, or the total in the economy, or how much variable capital the leather, textile and robotics industry uses, and how much surplus value is produced, easy. You can of course derive the value, although most of the time you usually know the value and you don't know the surplus value. It's something we have to, if you want to construct a Marxist account, it's something you have to calculate. I'm sorry, I tried to make them not black, but let's say different color. So basically, if you go now to public national accounts of any developed economy that usually have good data, you find how much constant capital these industries use, how much variable, and how much is the total value, let's say. Because total values are equal to total prices, but this is something we can explore later. And you can derive the surplus value, how much each industry exploits their workers. And based on these simple calculations, it's just algebra, no calculus, nothing crazy, just basic algebra, you know, from your primary school. Fractions, you know, from your primary school. You can derive how much is the organic composition of capital in this industry, how much is the rate of profit in this industry, then eventually the equalized rate of profit, the price, and how the decisions are taking place. So let's go through the table. This is the amount of capital these industries use. This is the amount of variable capital. The total value commodity, okay, let's say, let's assume that we know the rate of exploitation now. If you add those three, 60 plus 40 plus 40, you get the value of the leather. If you go textile, 70, 30, 30, the value of textile. Robotics, 80, 20, 20. Of course, robotics will use more constant capital, less workers. They will have different value. Try to construct the individual rate of profit. The leather capitalist, how much rate of profit faces? You take surplus value 40 divided by 60 plus 40 and you get for 30%. This is how much you get? I think so. The same for textile, the same for robotics. So basically you see that the robotics that have higher organic composition of capital and leather has lower composition of capital, they have the reverse profit rates here, composition of capital. So this is, you divide the constant capital 80 by what? I think I've made some calculations here. Give me a second. Yeah, yes, 140, then composition of capital is 80 divided by 20. 80 divided by 20. So yes, I corrected the values right now. So let's start. So these are, with the black are the values that we know, and the rest are the Marxist indicators that we can derive. The black color values are the values of constant capital, the variable capital, and the surplus value. And that gives birth, if you add them up, you have the value of the leather, the value of textile, and the value of robotics. But what the individual capitalists pay is the individual rate of profit. So if you divide the surplus value, 40, over the constant capital, 60 plus 40, you have 40% here for leather, 30% for textile, and 20% for robotics, as we expected. And if you do the correct calculations this time of organic composition of capital, so basically capital 60 divided by 40, you have 150, 70 divided by 30, 233%, 80 divided by 20, 400%. And these are the organic compositions of capital, and the average economy is of course 233. If you allow the forces of the market free and exchange and inter-industrial competition happens, so competition among leather, textile and robotics, eventually the rates of profit will equalize to this uniform capital R. So here if we aggregate all aggregate surplus values, so here 90 altogether, divided by constant capital 210 plus 90, you get the uniform rate of profit. So eventually the individual rate of profit that each capitalist faced was this 40, 30, 20, and after the equalization it became 30%. And if you add this to the price, so how we calculate the price, so basically capital plus fixed capital plus variable times 1 plus this, you end up having the price 130, 130, 130. So here I followed a very simplistic example. So the economy is also 390. So here what we see is 390, all prices together, is exactly equal to all values together. So here I followed a very easy example, therefore the prices appear to be the same. Or when sometimes you wonder why the iPhone is relatively cheap for the technology it contains, or a mobile phone is so cheap for the technology it contains. Even an old Nokia, as we saw in the previous lecture, is so cheap that the Nokia right now is probably less expensive than a tomato. So yes, you can see what we're talking about, equalization of prices. But this is a very simplistic example. In real life we don't have equalization of prices, but we have equalizations of rates of profit. And this is the total prices or the total values have produced in the whole economy. So here there is something to observe. A lot of people, a lot of economists do not accept the law of value. They don't think that if you add all values is equal to all prices. And therefore they don't believe that value is a reflection, is the substance behind prices. But here in this example we can see how clear this is. Although it's simple, the example, we can see that for the whole economy, whole national economy, if you want to do an analysis, not very detailed, quite crude, indeed all values, if you aggregate all values, is equal to all prices. And the other important thing we need to highlight here is that the deviation of price of production from value. The individual capitalist's value and price is never the same. The value here is 120, here is 130. For textile is 130, which coincides with its price, and for leather is 140, but the price is 130. So the deviation of price from value here is -10. So basically, the capitalist here has invested too much or has exploited too much labor. That at the end of the day ends up with a price which is less than the value. Textile, okay, breaking even. But robotics, lucky him, it's probably him. There are a lot of she nowadays in the robotics industry. Here we see a difference of 10, plus 10. So basically they have invested they have invested less. And the price is higher because the markets of the forces have impacted. And they end up with a higher price. So basically, who's winning? Who is the capitalist that through the inter-industrial competition is winning? Here we see is the robotics industry capitalist that is winning. And that's why you see a lot of capitals nowadays, instead of investing on things that we need, like health, education, fruits, vegetables, they invest on making iPhones more complicated and more advanced. Of course, there is a surveillance element there they want to cover, but there is, of course, an economic incentive behind that. And this is, the law of value. The law of value as it works on the whole economy through labor exploitation, etc., etc. A lot of people say, yes, but the price is not the same with value. True. The price almost never is the same with value. It can coincide, like for some historical moment, for some instance, at some point, let's say in the textile industry here, but it's almost never the same with value. And that's the contribution of Marx. And this does not cancel the law of value and its validity. Instead, it says it's a modified form of value. So the price, basically, it's some kind of modified law of value. Even in calculation, it's C plus V for value, plus the surplus value. But for price, it's C plus V after the market had its effect on price. So for Marx, this does not cancel the validity of value, the law of value, but it reinforces it. It says it exists, but because of how perplexed the economy is, inter-industrial competition, intra-industrial competition, exploitation, organic composition of capital, because of all these things, it appears like the law of value is not true. But it is, both mathematically and empirically. And at the end of the day, if you want to aggregate the whole economy and do an analysis of the whole economy, not of industries, prices are exactly equal to the values. So I did all this analysis to, first of all, reinforce how the law of value is true, empirically and theoretically. Okay, here we talk more theoretically. There are empirical works you can find, we can discuss later as well in the seminars. But this is the main concept, that value does describe how prices move, and also it tells you where they're going to move. They're going to move towards these robotics, or the high composition of capital industry that will give you higher profit, lower rate of profit at the beginning, but eventually you will have bigger deviation from what you invested and what the actual price is. That's the inter-industrial competition for Marx. That's how capitalism works. Of course, this table doesn't take place in a day or in 2 days or a year even. It might take months or years until from here and the individual rate of profit, we end up in a uniform rate of profit. So it might take some time. And there are Marxist approaches that provide more advanced analysis on that. This is kind of a new interpretation or a new solution approach, so based predominantly on volume 1 of Marx. But there are Marxists that incorporate time and they make calculations even more complicated. And not every Marxist agrees on which one is the best, but there are more advanced approaches. That's my point. And these approaches do not cancel the validity of law of value, but instead reinforcing it. And to conclude, For Marx, this process doesn't stop. This is how capitalism works, and the process of accumulation of capital. And the accumulation of capital basically means that the constant capital that our economy had in year 2000 over variable capital was smaller than in 2010 and even bigger now in 2020. So eventually, the organic composition of capital in our economy will become higher and higher, and therefore less and less people will be employed. That's why we end up having the technological unemployment. So more and more people joining the unemployed, or as Marx describes, the relative surplus population, or the reserved army of labor. So the industrial reserve army of labor is a consequence of capital accumulation, this process I described. And it is a requirement for capital accumulation. You need unemployed to be there standby in case of a new industry emerges to hire them. For instance, the gig economy. There was unemployment before gig economy started, and all these unemployed people eventually became riders in Deliveroo, generally delivery people in Amazon and all the other industries. So capitalism needs unemployment. It cannot work without unemployment. It's a necessary precondition, not only to drop the wages of the already employed and say, if you don't accept this low wage, I'm going to hire the unemployed, but because they also want to move them from industry to industry, because the rates of profit are different and they can make more absolute profits as well. So the reserve army of labor is not just an outcome of capitalism, it's a necessary requirement for capitalism to exist. So if someone wants to eliminate unemployment, they probably have to design a new system that will have zero unemployment. Or if one industry for a reason shuts down, for environmental reasons, for anything, there should be a transition of these these unemployed people immediately, not to remain without income, for instance. So this is the birth of the reserve army of labor, and in terms of mainstream accounts, less and less money goes to labor. So this is the labor share of non-farm business USA. So basically everyone else except for farming, the labor share falls constantly because of the process of accumulation, also as reflected in the United States. Due to capital accumulation, the labor drops, or through the process that is called the immiseration of proletariat. And what is a country acts as a good example, unfortunately, to see the immiseration of proletariat from the American dream eventually seeing so many homeless people joining the gig economy who know they cannot survive on this wage, etc., etc. And this is where Marx says that's why capitalism has this contradiction. On the one hand, they want to develop, so immiseration of proletariat due to relative and absolute poverty sharpens the contradiction between labor of capital. So basically, the contradiction is evolved to contradiction between social character of production, that a lot of workers around the world are coming together through this process. It's not the individual feudalist with the individual serfs now that don't communicate with the neighboring serfs, but it's a global economy coming together. So a socialist character of production, but private ownership of capitalists over the products, over the means of production and the products of labor. And this suppresses the development of the workers and the development of technologies. Only the technologies that are profitable will be implemented, not the technologies that can cure cancer once and for all, or technologies that can make workers' life much easier, but usually technologies that will increase the surveillance of worker, or the technologies that can be commodified. So this is how the system, the contemporary relations of production, the contemporary legal framework that is legal to own privately means of production, suppressing the forces of production, what technology and labor is capable of doing. And that's the end of the second lecture, the lecture of Marx on surplus value, wages and the rate of profit. And in the third lecture we're going to cover profitability crisis and rectification. So summary, last lecture we covered value, today we covered exploitation, and we go to profitability and rectification for final one to understand why destruction of capital happens and why capitalists might pursue even worse for that. Thank you. I know it's also another compact lecture. Keep notes, ask questions. I'm very happy to discuss and answer as much as I can. Thank you.